We are joined tonight by some wonderful and talented individuals, and I'd like to introduce everyone to you. Can we please give it up to our amazing panelists? For them, yes. Okay, I'm gonna read a few bios for you. So we're gonna start with Ms. 𝘏𝘦𝘬𝘬𝘪𝘶. 𝘏𝘏𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘪 is the executive director of In Black Inc., which creates space where the stories and voices of people of African heritage are celebrated, documented, and archived through publications, professional development training opportunities, and public presentations. CSR was a publisher at Papyrus Publishing Incorporated. She is a school psychologist in the Minneapolis Public School District and a volunteer coordinator or instructor at the 𝘚𝘦𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬 Science Academy, a K-8 cultural STEM Saturday program in St. Paul. She was the board chair of the Cultural Wellness Center in Minneapolis and is currently on the U of M Friends of the Library board. 𝘏𝑒𝑡, in her heart, is a creator with training in fashion and the illustrative arts. She enjoys creating art through her sewing, drawing, and writing. 𝘏𝑒𝑡 is married and has 3 children. And I also want to say something that was really beautiful when I had a conversation with Ms. 𝘏𝑒𝑡 about being on this panel. She mentioned that she does, a lot of workshops with Black folks in community, and there was one that she did where she had folks kind of create their own personal archives. And she talked about how people were starting to see each other's relatives or ancestors in their photos and like bringing these photos and be like, hey, that's my auntie, or hey, that's my loved one, that's my family member. And I just want to thank you and honor you today for doing that work and bringing our community together and showing us that like these connections and relationships that we make go way farther and deeper than just, on the surface, you and I meeting. Sometimes like our grandparents might have known each other, especially if you have roots here, like so many of the folks on this panel tonight. So please give it up for Ms. 𝘏𝑒𝑡 𝑐SR. JoKita Bell is the curator of the Seeking for the Lost exhibition, which is the exhibition that this event is inspired by and connected to. So I highly encourage you to go look at that exhibition when we're done talking about this or having this panel discussion. So JoJo Bell is curator of Seeking for the Lost, executive director and director of exhibitions and programming for the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota. Her roles with the organization have led to collaborative programming with state historical institutions like the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Museum of American Art. She has also appeared as an expert in the Minnesota Historical Society's documentary storied African Americans in World War I. In 2019, JoJo curated the Builders exhibition for AAICM, which was named one of the top 10 art exhibitions of the year by the Star Tribune, which is amazing, JoJo. Thank you for all of your amazing work, and I'm so excited to hear from you today. Yes. We're gonna come back to you, Davu. We're gonna go to 𝘚𝘦𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝑚. is an interdisciplinary artist experimenting with textiles, moving image, and cultural curation. Her primary medium is film focusing on documentary, oral history, and digital projections. The goal is to experiment with how to visualize the intersections of the archive, Black folklore, and Black science fiction. The root of her work is archiving Black traditional and historical practices around love, pleasure, cultural expression, and community building. Period, Zania. Her community-held positions are the engagement manager for the field at Root Springs in Annandale, Minnesota, media education specialist at SPNN, and co-founder and executive director of Tangible Collective based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This conversation is inspired by a conversation that Zania had connected to her exhibition that she curated last year, where she's actually building an archive right now that is in process for the Hollywood Studio of Dance on Broadway Avenue, which is just Unreal. Please give it up for Zania. And last but certainly not least, North Minneapolis native 𝘚𝘰𝘢𝘕 is the curator of the Givens Collection of African American Literature and Life at Elmer L. Anderson Library here at the University of Minnesota. He is co-author of the book Sights, Sounds, Soul, the Twin Cities through the lens of Charles Chambliss, and is an award-winning, internationally recognized musician and composer. Interdisciplinary. Please give it up for 𝘚𝘰𝘢𝘕. Yes. So we're going to get the talk started in a moment, but at the end of the talk, we're going to have a Q&A, and we're going to be using an app called Slido. So we're going to take a minute to practice, but also get us started in kind of engaging in the conversation that we're going to have tonight. And so I'm going to ask, if you got a smartphone, if you could pull it out and use this QR code. And if you could answer the question above with just one word or a phrase. It is, what does archiving mean to you? So you just write it down on that QR code and let us know what archiving means to you. Not the definition in the dictionary, but to you. Period. Yes. So we have some really beautiful words on here. I'm going to just list a few. We have memory, learn, preservation, preserving memories, safekeeping, witnessing. That one hit me in my chest. Future building. That one also hit me in my chest. Family, holding on, reverence, community. Yes, I love this. So at the end of this conversation, we're going to have a Q&A portion and opportunity for you all to ask questions to anyone, if not everyone, on this panel. And so you're going to use the QR code and send in some of those questions, and we will see them pop up on the board. So I just ask that, and I already feel the vibe in here. I know we won't have no problems, but just in case we might, please try to keep your questions respectful and on topic, and let's try to stay away from comments and ask questions that are going to add to the conversation and be respectful to these amazing people who took their time out to come and speak to us today. You feel me? Say, I feel you. Thank you. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to let this talk take place. Thank you. Please give it up for our panelists, y'all.
Thank you guys for coming this evening. Thank you. I'm actually really excited about this. I've known a few of these people on this panel for a short period of time, but they are really, really amazing folks. So I'm going to jump right in because I don't want to hear my voice. I want to hear their voices, and I want to hear what they say about this amazing topic, because when I saw the title of your exhibit, JoJo, I was really, really, like when something hits you in the pit of your stomach, it felt so visceral that I really wanted to know. Can you start us off by just letting us know what inspired you to start with that as the title of your exhibit?
So some of you know that the exhibition is, based off of ads that were placed in the Appeal, so a Black newspaper, historical newspaper here in Minnesota. And when I go back and forth when I'm researching, that column always came up, right? So I'd always see it, seeking for the lost, seeking for the lost. And like you said, it's like a visceral experience. And even just, especially doing that while researching. Mm-hmm. And so I knew that, what other, you know what I mean? And I felt like, what other title could it have besides that? Yeah.
We're going to come back to that as well. I kind of put this question in front of the question that I really wanted to start with, because I really need us to really think about that. So if you guys can add that to the next question I ask you, but kind of weave it in. I want you to describe your work and how you think it directly impacts the movement of memory keeping and the practice of Black archiving. And you can, I don't know, define each of those if you'd like in terms of how you approach it. But thinking about JoJo's title, Seeking for the Lost, and how your work actually impacts, or how your work directly impacts that whole concept of memory keeping.
Are we supposed to be talking, we're supposed to be looking at you guys or outwards? I just thought about that. Yeah, I would say for me, I about like 4 years ago started exploring visual representations of archives with my own work. So my background is in documentary film and in projection mapping. And so I kind of made the transition from documentary film, oral histories, to large-scale projections with found footage, archival footage, fabricated footage. And so thinking about scale and immersiveness of what people would perceive as archival pieces. And then I made a transition to exhibition and installation through the Emerging Curators Institute, and that was my first time kind of conceptualizing a full thing. And I think through that project, I learned a lot, and I learned that I don't really know as much as I thought I knew about all the processes possible. And that was one of my first times taking on an archive and thinking about an archive. And like Ricky had mentioned, it's the Hollywood Studio of Dance. I went there in '99 to '01. And Miss Diane has been on that corner for, I think, going on 32 years now, and she owns that portion of the space. And I went back to her because she wanted some videos digitized, and so that was kind of my entry point to that. And so I think through that process, I've learned to experiment with how archives can be immersive and pull people in and kind of extract little pieces as entry points. I think oftentimes people need a way to access it. And so I think I've been using visual representation, whether that be projection mapping, fabrication, experimental video, just to allow people access and entry points and feel, I don't know, ownership, see reflection, and like not think of it as something so stagnant, but also something playful and fun.
Last night, JoJo gave a book talk at Majors and Quinn about your new book on Hilda Sims, Black woman from Minnesota, born 1918, Minneapolis, North Side, Projects, Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House. Y'all from Chicago, ain't you? And one of the things I asked you was, why do this work? And you said something about belonging. So, and I agreed that, so I'm the homeboy. My family been in this state since 1862. Fugitive slaves. And I done got big and uppity and get to travel and go places and tell people where I'm from. And they say, Minnesota? They got black folks in Minnesota? And I haven't always known that my family's been here since 1862, but my body, I think, has. And so part of the work that I do, which includes that book that was mentioned, which includes this new path over at the Givens Collection across the Washington Avenue Bridge, over at Elmer Anderson Library, is following in the footsteps of others who came before me, my teachers, my elders, who trust me with taking up the work of keeping the memory of my people in this place, in these places, I should say, actually. And also they trust me to be creative, like this exhibit. They don't want me just copying. And so it's essential to what I do. I'm learning, it's feeling more and more like deep purpose. I spend a lot of time, we can spend a lot of time doing for ourselves. This country encourages it. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now, JoJo, can you
Yes.
add to that as well?
Yes, I can. You know, I think I've gotten this question a few times, like over my live career, like starting here with history career. You know, why you're doing this? And I think things are not as complicated as people want to make them. So for me, and you referenced belonging, it's simply that I grew up in school systems here that didn't tell my history. If it was enslavement. If it was South, East Coast, West Coast, you know, as you're saying, kind of erasing us from that history. And so I think a sense of belonging, because again, what you learn is the white male pioneer trope, right? That white immigrants or white people who were born here, came here, you know, settled the land. Obviously under that is like, you know, indigenous disposition, right? Settled the land and made cities, and now it's great, you know? So I wanted to scratch the surface of that too, and just understand and understand how it's related to historical memory. So, you know, there's history, but then there's historical memories, like how people want to be remembered. You know, who wants to be remembered and who gets to tell that story too.
You're all telling stories. You're all telling those stories in your own way, through your own medium, your path that you've taken as archivists, literary artists, visual artists. How, that's right, we're double dutching. Oh, music, I'm sorry. I thought he was doing the double dutch. I'm not a drummer, so I don't know. But you're all doing this, and I should say we're all doing this. I keep trying to step out of this conversation, but the collection of the stories that you pull out of, you know, the Givens collections, those stories that come across your desk, the ceramics that you work with, and the other mediums that you work with to create the art that you feel from a generation or two ago. Like what has laid your foundation? What has led you there? Like, what's the thinking behind when you sit down and you try to sort through all that?
Don't get lost.
Okay.
You really can't really. So let me tell you a story, maybe. Let me tell a story.
You are a storyteller.
About stories.
Go ahead. So,
humble brag, the book. Sight, Sound, Souls, The Twin Cities Through the Lens of Charles Chambliss was published in 2017, Minnesota Historical Society Press. They came and asked me on the strength of some Facebook posts if I would be interested in coming and looking at a collection of photographs that they had in the archive. And I said, sure, went into the Hollinger boxes that they brought out for me, and went through the folders and started finding pictures that looked familiar, even if I didn't at first recognize the people in them. The places looked familiar. The way that the ink was fading in these photographs looked familiar, burnt orange and weird browns, because I was born in 1978. A moment when photo technology changes. And so if you go through your people's photographs and you look at the 70s, the pictures look the same. Same with the 90s. They looked very much the same based on the technology. I didn't know nothing about this then. Bill Cotman told me. Bill Cotman told me. So I'm going through photos, don't recognize people at first, but then eventually I start recognizing people. You know, important people, and then eventually my family, my mom and my dad and my cousins, and places along Plymouth Avenue that I remember when I was a kid. Stories that I remember old folks telling around card tables. And so then I said, yes, I'll write the book. Because I saw myself in this array of things and places and people. And it was so much easier to write that book than it was to write my dissertation, because I saw myself in it. And it seemed more consequential than my dissertation. So a friend told me, a dear friend, when I decided to really pull the plug on my dissertation, ain't nobody ever been on their deathbed said, if only I'd finished my dissertation. So there was a sense of belonging that was clear to me in the archive. And because I'm stubborn and from this place and travel and encounter people who don't think we got black folks or pride, I took it as my charge, because I went to school and got some chops to help tell these stories about things that I knew. And I'll end by saying one of the most fascinating things about two things. One of the most fascinating things about the work was that included in the Charles Chandler's photographs is a black and white group shot at the Elks Club on Plymouth Avenue from 1976, February 1976. It's the first month-long celebration of Black history in the state of Minnesota. That photograph hung in my grandmother's house, and then my mother's house, and now it hangs in my house. The color version of it, though. It was one that Chambliss took as a series. He was there on February, Black History Month event, shooting multiple shots of this group, the drum and bugle team. I had no clue my whole childhood that this picture that I got, the only picture that I ever saw with my mom and my dad in it, was taken by Charles Chambliss. And so again, a sense of belonging, cultural pride, evidence that there's a great deal of pride in Black community in this place. We love being Black just like the rest in this very white place.
Oh, I would say, so I think thinking about how we got here, how I got here, I would say it's a mixture of people who chose to document those spaces and the people who chose to make those spaces. So what's interesting is when I started on my archive project, I didn't know where I was starting at, and I went to a Blackgate meeting and workshop gathering led by 𝘱𝘰 and 𝘚𝘕𝘦𝘬𝘕, and it was a beautiful time, and that's where I met 𝘱𝘰𝘴𝘵, who's also working on 𝘱𝘰's archive currently, and her and I had a beautiful relationship that just spawned out of this common interest, and I started going to 𝘱𝘰's studio where she's doing that archiving project, and that's kind of where I started to just know what archiving is, because I didn't really know what it was. I knew it anecdotally, but I wasn't really aware. And it's kind of pinpointing those moments and finding those connections that makes it feel, it's like the geeky, nerdy part about it. That's I know that person, I know that place. And she pulled out your book, and your book had, I had been scanning in photos of Miss Diane that day, and I opened up your book, and one of the first photos was a photo of Miss Diane when she was, I think, late teens, and she was in front of a club, all dolled up. And so it was all these different layers of, I guess, access for me, where it's the framing of people who have been doing this work allow me the space to continue to do the work and see myself reflected in the process and see the people that I love and the people that have supported me in the same way. And I think it's somebody photographed Miss Diane, and Miss Diane has all these different encounters she's had. And she's also a woman trying to hold space in a environment that's ever changing, and people are always trying to take away, especially on the North Side currently. And so it's as an up and coming arts organizer, and I've had a collective for 7 years now, and that's been a lot to hold on to. So I can't imagine holding on to a space for 32 years. And so it's all these different layers of people who decided to do a thing long enough for me to see the thing done. And I'm oh, I can do the thing. But it does take a lot for us to stay somewhere long enough to make an impact. And I think the archives and like all of that help the life extend a little longer, long enough for somebody to like get an idea and get motivated and inspired enough to be like, oh, I can do that, or I see myself in that. And I think along with the exhibition, it's like erasure happens so fast, and unless we get creative about the ways that we repurpose history or revisualize it, it's often inaccessible.
So we're talking about our identities. I work at this university, at an academic library. We're primarily the people coming to discover. I mean, the tradition encourages us to pretend like we're objective and outside of the thing we're studying. We know that that's false. We change the thing by interacting with it. And so primarily this incredibly precious rare book collection of over 10,000 archival objects and rare books that lives over in the river bluff over there across the way is a cultural and educational resource for people interested in uncovering the history of African American literature and culture. But for folks, I've been referring to it as a kind of settlement house. University students come here for 4 to 8 years. They spend a lot of time trying to find their way, engaging. You know, all the Black student resources on campus are all spread out. And you spend 4 years to 8 years trying to find one another. And sometimes people can come and not even realize the collection is over there. And so I've been meeting with people who ain't from here and saying, hey, I'm the homeboy, like I just did, and telling them how this archive got here, the people who understood, folks who took over Morrill Hall, right, became our first Black mayors, worked on with the Board of Regents to, provide opportunities for Black students on campus. Black folk, enterprising Black folks who got together with their families to make sure that this rare commodity, just to be real, came here and would be a resource for academic researchers, but then people off campus, again, the people for whom this work is about identity. And so we're, as somebody working for a big institution like this, I'm kind of between those two worlds often, and I can feel sort of like I'm code switching sometimes, which I don't mind doing because I'm from Minnesota. You could be moving between those worlds, but there's something special about taking up the work to follow people who taught me, because staying connected is how we win.
Can I just say something? I feel like your both ideas are really connected, especially when I think about my own work. So reimagining and then the archives. And you hit on that it's supposed to be, or we're supposed to be objective, but also what is an archive? What counts as an archive? Is it just paper? Could it be material objects, visualizing? And I only think about that because there are a few Black women historians who are trying to navigate just that. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with Tyra Miles, but she wrote, and I cannot even say the name of this book without her, but she wrote All That She Carried, and it's about a woman who was about to be sold away from her daughter. And so she put things in there, I think it was pecans, something else, and then later it survived actually. And I think it was Ruth or someone made in the 50s or 60s inscribed on it, "It be filled with my love always." So she's trained. She's trained in the discipline of history, but she's taken this material thing, and using that to tell a larger story too.
I think you all hit on something. I know Ricky mentioned that we did a few community archival meetings about a year ago, and it was just absolutely moving because you had people, bringing out those dusty old boxes of stuff that was sitting somewhere for a long time. and they were pulling it out and didn't know each other. The folks that we had two cohorts of community members, and none of them really knew of each other, but they were looking at each other's pictures and just recognizing family members in each other's pictures. They were looking at each other's pictures and recognizing stories, common stories they had. One woman talked about her great-grandmother who came up to Minnesota with a reverend on the train because her family only had girls, and they couldn't leave the state without a male chaperone. And so she came up here with a Reverend Battle, actually, and got here, and their families didn't know each other when they lived, where they came from. But now, that's the church they go to. They've been going to that church for the last, 60 or so years. And so their family have become a family. But one of the things I really feel is just moving about what you guys said actually speaks to the next question. I went to a conference, and I was mentioning this earlier to the group, about a month ago in Fort Scott, Kansas, that recognizes Gordon Parks. And they had a fifth grader, I believe, an elementary school age young lady, who stood up because the school brought them to the conference for a couple of days. And she stood up and talked about how she believed memories and dreams are very similar. And she was asking about how do you kind of create memory aids to help you remember those things. It's kind of like, you dream about something and you wake up and you can only hold it for a certain amount of time. And so that's kind of what the archive for me is. And it's out of the mouth of a fifth grader. So I was just so amazed at her, the parallel that she made. And I feel like when you're thinking about your archive and how the collection, how you put it together, how you want to tell the stories you're telling, like, what are some of the ways that you, create that? How do you come up with that? How do you decide that these are things that are important for us to highlight or elevate or pull out of that dusty old box that probably have a million other pieces of stuff? Or is there a pattern? Is there a system?
I would say, I think for me, I don't necessarily identify with a process per se, but I do think with archiving there's work. There's always work, whether that's labeling, sorting, scanning, digging, reading, talking to people, looking for new things. So I think staying consistent with the work gets me closer to the things. And answers come out of that, titles come out of that, conversations come out of that, next steps come out of that. And I think oftentimes archiving can kind of be a little mundane. And if you're not always, at least for me, I find myself sometimes not always being the most energized about my topic. Like, ooh, I have 150 photos to scan today. That doesn't, that's not the thing that does it. But you get there and you start, and I think I just lean on trusting the process and trusting the work, that the things come when they come. And I think that was one of the beautiful things about my last project, because the exhibition was called Saturday Mornings and the Faces We Remember. And so Miss Diane had over 250 group portraits of young girls over the last 32 years who have gone through her dance school. And there are people that I didn't even know went there, and I can see the adult faces and the little kid faces, and I was like, I know her. And I was screenshotting them and sending them to people on Facebook, and they're like, where did you get this? And where did you? And so I think that feeling or that emotion keeps me consistent enough to do the work that then leads you to the next thing. So I think it's just staying committed and interested and engaged in the process of it all.
For me, there's very much a process, but I think it's interesting because it's kind of the opposite in that sometimes I don't get things done because I'm in an archive and I'm learning so many different things, maybe not even things that I came there for, and then trying to keep it in my mind, right, to an aid, but what would I come back to that I think is important for people to know? And a lot of my exhibitions and my work is really based off of, I think people would be interested in this, right? Like, I'm blown away by this. I wonder what other people would feel about this too.
That's great, thank you. So the meaning of an archive can, in some cases, not be understood until somebody comes looking for something. When I was in graduate school here, I was spent 5 years with the Givens Collection, and the part to me that I couldn't do, because I'm trained in literary scholarship and telling stories and interpretation, analysis, was hierarchical description. And thinking that way, it's not my way. And so I'd get bored processing the Penumbra Theater archive, because I'd get stuck, like, going too far, when really I'm there to be describing at the folder level, you know, what's in it. Basic description. So I would occasionally, to save my soul, go in 90 feet below into the crypt and start digging around. And one day I was down there and I found a shirt box. I tell this story every tour that I give, when we go into the vault where the Givens Collection is housed. I found a shirt box. It was Montgomery Ward's or Carson Perry Scott, or some of y'all know what I'm talking about. And it had a label on it that said, "Do not open ex-slave narratives." Narratives. I opened the box. And what I find are manuscripts that are crumbling and falling apart, and they're all curled up, but you can see handwriting and you can see typed print. And I take them upstairs to the then curator, who was brand new. They started when I started, and my fellowship. And I said, "What are these?" And she said, "I don't know." And she went into the electronic database, and there was no record in the electronic database. And so we went and found the oldest person in the building, who had been there the longest, and said, "Can you help?" And he went and found an old wooden box with a whole bunch of little drawers in it, card catalog, and found a card, because maybe found a number somewhere in the box with the manuscripts, and then that number corresponded to a number on a card, which had somebody's name on it and a date, and it told us when the things got there. And we also found out that there were facsimiles, copies of these things taken in the 80s, Xeroxes, ugly. And so then we had them sent off to conservation, who put them in, you know, that's the great thing. It's the difference between the community archiving work we do off campus and what I'm able to do here with the resources of the university, is that they immediately sent it off to conservation, where they put it in some machine where it humidified the paper, and then they slowly flattened everything out and slowly dried it and put it in archival, you know, Mylar, and now they're available to people, and you can handle them. And it turns out, they are the only copies of some narratives taken down by people who were still alive in the 1930s, who had been slaves in Coahoma County, Mississippi. They only live in the Givens Collection. And it was because a graduate student was digging around, bored with hierarchical description, that we're now telling these stories. And there's some extremely remarkable stories in the narratives, but then the history of how it came here, its provenance and all that. It's the history of, and archives aren't neutral. They're contested spaces. Some people keep a record to lie. May I, 1 second?
You may.
I brought the news with me. I'm going to be honest, I have not checked out the headlines since last Wednesday morning. But I was in a meeting this morning with some folks who turned me on to this article from October 30th, not long ago, in the Wall Street Journal. The headline is, "America's top archivist puts a rosy spin on U.S. history, pruning the thorny parts. Plans for new exhibits at the National Archives Museum, including swapping a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. marching for civil rights for former President Nixon greeting Elvis." U.S. Archivist 𝘚𝘦𝘦𝘬𝘕 and her top advisors at the National Archives and Records Administration, which operates a popular museum on the National Mall, have sought to de-emphasize negative parts of U.S. history. She has ordered the removal of prominent references to such landmark events as the government's displacement of indigenous tribes and the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II from planned exhibits. It goes on to say that part of her freak out has to do with the former president and stuff being found at his place in Florida, and threats to the National Archives. Shogun's senior aides ordered that that a proposed image of civil rights leader Martin Luther King be cut from a planned Step into History photo booth in the Discovery Center. The booth will give visitors a chance to take photos of themselves superimposed alongside historic figures. The aides also ordered the removal of labor union pioneer Dolores Huerta and Minnie Spotted Wolf, the first Native American woman to join the Marine Corps, from the photo booth, according to the current and former employees and agency documents. The aides propose using instead images of former President Nixon greeting Elvis and former President Ronald Reagan with baseball player Cal Ripken Jr. So instead of the Federal Writers Project's ex-slave narratives, right, we are to keep the memory of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, which we know is a lie. Yeah. These are contested spaces. The people who gathered and kept the slave narratives, the ex-slave narratives, were pro-slavery sympathizers who kept these narratives taken, given by Black people who were the descendants of the people they had owned. I'm sorry, they were previously owned by the family on this plantation. They kept the record to show that we were unworthy of freedom. Researchers tell me when they come to these, because I haven't read all of them, there are several in the archive, that one of the things that is one of the most prominent features is that it's clear that the people speaking are doing so under duress. They're not free when asked, what was slavery times like? Yeah. They're not free to say exactly what it was like, except for one woman. Her name was Colleen Brown. Come on over and I'll show you.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. That actually takes us to our next question, because we know this is contested space. We know that exhibit actually brings to life or kind of makes it tangible some of the memories that people would prefer to forget. The separation of families, the just what happens when you take children from parents, from mothers and fathers, and you take mothers and fathers from children, and you move people around like cattle or other forms of property. How do you, and I'm gonna actually read this question because I don't want to get it wrong, but I believe the work of Jojo Bell and Christopher Harrison, who's the artist that actually created the the paintings that you see in the exhibit, which are absolutely beautiful, is the act of creating memory aids to remind us of the loss that was experienced and impacted us. With all the banning of books, with the erasure tactics through the removal of DEI departments, programs, and those that support them, how are we changing the current narratives of who these people were, are, and similar exhibits, not just this exhibit, but how are we actually changing that narrative?
So how is it addressing that narrative? I think in some ways it's kind of pushing back against, that erasure that's happening that you talked about and that you just, also spoke about. And again, it wasn't necessarily like a radical thought in my mind when I'm putting the exhibition together, right? But it is interesting to have something like this up and then read the headlines and think, oh, would somebody take this down because they don't want people to know that slavery, existed, or well, I hope they do. But like families are broken up, right? I think that about my book as well. Hilda Sims, she was an outspoken Black woman. Like, is that book gonna get banned? So I think it's kind of like like an answer to that in a sense, and I'm not sure if I'm necessarily changing anything, but it's just kind of like a resisting against some of those things are happening.
I think when we have like the resources to do stories justice, especially when it comes to like archival pieces, it's like we get to add the humanity back in. And I think that's the part that's important, and that's the part that's missing. And I think I never really understood it when people used to talk about like the humanity from the story is missing, or like I didn't really feel it necessarily. But I think through the exhibition, it really got me thinking about like that form of a visual means something, like for the reflection of the time period, paired with like the context of the appeal and what was happening post-Civil War and kind of all of that. And it's like it gave those feelings, that history comes with a texture and an image. And I think we get to revive it with like whatever means we have. And so I think those paintings, like the refabrications of those, are the interpretation of that, paired with the context. And it's like, oh, that's a perfect entry point to like want to know more and like want to look for more. And so, yeah, I think sometimes I call it like negress references. I like love certain images, and like people are like, oh, that's like so degrading, or it's not, it shouldn't be shown of Black people or whatever that is. And I think me and my mom were talking about it, and she was like, the mammy or like that figure is only like not a good image in the wrong hands or out of context. But it's like in context, that's like, that means so much more to us for what it was and like what it reflects of our history, our experiences, and our relationships to each other. So it's like, yeah, I think the exhibition really helps give history a visual texture. And it's like, oh, you can really play with how do we represent something to somebody, and how can we just make creative entry points. And it's like, I guess for what archiving may have been or has been looked at as, I think we can take on more freedom with what that is. And it's like, if you have a piece that's true and I have a piece that's true, and we have like some things we can put together that's valid, and that is the thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm serious, because the lesson I've taken from Black women like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston is that this is about recovery. The archive is about recovery and healing.
Enough said. They said it. The actual exhibit. Has most people seen the exhibit? Show of hands. Okay, so you have to do that. I don't know if it'll be open tonight after we're done here, but is it? Okay, so that. Okay, so
I'm with
great.
you. It feels dark, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
it feels later.
Yeah, it does feel.
Can I actually mention something about the exhibit that I think
Yes.
is important? Because we talked about this when we gathered first, all right? So I might be wrong in how I'm remembering, but there's an article, a Seeking for the Lost column from the 1890s. It's someone seeking a woman who they haven't seen since 1861, 30-some years, right? And they mention how she was last seen here, thinks she was sold either to this state, or somebody in this state, or this state, and again, after 30-some years, they're trying to recover this person. I'm not sure how often people were successful at that, but I'm a bit pessimistic.
I have two things to that, and I hope I don't lose them because lots going on in the brain today. But so you mentioned the description, right, and how that was them before. But there might be describing them before, but obviously they don't look like that anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? So it is kind of a memory like that. And another thing to say, you're not sure if they reunited. Some folks actually did. I have to say there's, so these ads were actually across the nation. And there is a catalog, I'm trying to think. I think it's called Information Wanted. And there are people who are archiving the whole thing, you know, Alabama, Mississippi, wherever. And I think the first ones were in the Christian Recorder. So, and what they post there, I saw like 1 or 2 reunions, you know, but it's not, you know, always going to happen for everyone. It's less likely.
And so one of the things we spoke about in terms of this, you know, success or not with recovering someone was, so there's this process that the archive demonstrates of seeking through the papers, right? It's a process of seeking. Then there's the artist and the curator going into the archive and recovering through the rendering. So you mentioned interpretation, right? People come to the archive. A lot of people I give tours to come just to be there and to go and cry and just like visiting the castles in Ghana or Senegal. But it's also about then engaging with it, activating it in some way and rendering it, changing it, making art, imagining the dream, right? Turning what was otherwise just a recollection into something, imagining more, generating. It's life-affirming stuff. We add to it, we participate with it, and that's how we heal.
Yeah, I think for those of you who haven't been able to see it, just a little bit of a description of what the archive, you talked a little about the name in terms of where that came from, but what the archive, how did it come about? Like, how did you move to that place of this is what I wanted to look like? How do you and the artist, I should say, because he helped to imagine it.
Right, yeah, I think I had that initial thought that you were talking about of giving them voice again, regenerating these people, kind of like they could relive in that moment. And I thought the best way would be like portraiture. And I asked Christopher Harrison, who's just amazing and also very open and nice person, and he's like, sure. So I was like, yay, and then so we just did it together. Like I stayed out of his stuff just let him go. So I think that marriage of the archives on my part, like providing that to him, and then what he did with it, they can stay separate and then come together. And I think like a lot of our exhibitions, when I think about that, I had someone say to me like, oh, you know, this is like really an intersection between art and history. And I'm like, I didn't believe it at the time, but now I think it's even inched more toward that for us too.
Oh, definitely. I think that was, both of those might have been words that popped up there when people thought about archives. I mean, I think we're beautiful and stuff, but I wish you would put those words back up. Because I think it helps generate some thoughts around making life out of these images that someone held in their mind. They had to describe this person or give a picture of that moment. So I totally understand when you say they don't look like that anymore. But the person was left with that image. And in seeking something after it's been gone for however long, that's the image that they go back to recover it. But question, in terms of your, we talked a little about process, not process, no process, but in terms of Black archiving Black family or Black community information, whether it be literary, visual, you know, in terms of the visual arts, music, any of those areas. What do you think we need to do in terms of like, what are next steps in terms of where we need to go with this? Because we have, it feels like we're playing catch up in some ways. People are really afraid of, you know, those boxes of stuff. And a lot of times it ends up on the corner or on the curb after the person has passed. And so you don't get to transfer a lot of knowledge because we've always been a people that's almost nomadic in our existence. We have to be able to get up and go, you know, at a moment's notice. So how do you do that?
We got to be able to get up and go at a moment's notice. My people landed in Hastings in 1862 and were gone by the early part of the 20th century with all the other black families in Hastings. They had to get up and go. The church was burned down. The AME church was burned down in 1907 by likely incendiaries, the newspaper article tells us. That's how we know the story, is because someone saw a photograph of a black congregation in the Hastings Gazette in front of a church that ain't there no more. And this story that tells that, you know, in the story that tells us about systemic racism. The press only covered it for in one edition of the newspaper, and the police stopped talking about it after that one edition. That's what I think the woke people mean by institutional racism. That community that used to be in that little river town during the Industrial Revolution was forgotten, but for an elder in Hastings, an older woman, white woman, named Heidi Langenfeld, who had some memory since her childhood of there having been a black community in Hastings. So she went to the Hastings Historical Society, their library, and found a folder that some librarian post the moment when it's common practice to refer to us as black, had taken all the files she could find, because she found some scattered about this white archive of several black people and places, and put them all into one folder that said, and labeled it, described it as Black Community of Hastings. Why Black Studies? Because we're gonna get lost on this campus unless we don't put us in one folder where people who are interested in us can find us. Because you're gonna go into Wilson Library otherwise and be looking for Langston amid the library, right? Oh, they'll open the door and make room for us, but you know, why do all the black kids sit at the same lunch table? You know this stuff, right? There is a need to gather up, right? To seek, to gather, to describe, and then to doggedly keep, so that people can come and use and interpret and describe and more, and provide counter evidence, that the counter evidence to what people in Hastings say today. But did they actually contribute anything to this community? Why would we have a special acknowledgement of their presence here? That is what people say, well-meaning people say at the community gatherings in Hastings around its Black history. Why do we need a special recognition for these people? Did they contribute anything special here?
And I think on the same front as counter evidence, I think my one reference to that is through reading and listening to Saidiya Hartman, and under her idea of critical fabulation, and I feel like this is a key example, and I think that's one of the things that when I talk about, and I haven't figured it out yet, but it's like, I think there's something about Black folklore where it's like Black folks in memory, we can be like one generation removed and all of a sudden it's like very folklorish. And it's like, you could really go talk to that person and ask them the details, but we're not going to. So it's like the man, the myth, the legend of like what happened. Black folks have so much folklore. And then it's like the same thing with science fiction that we see with like Octavia Butler, and it's like reimagining, but it's very historical and it's very accurate and it's very representative of now and the past, and like very fortune telling. And so I think where kind of all these things collide, the work is being done and has been done, and it's like layered, and like I think the way we access it comes Like that's a key part, like it being there. And so I think the pieces of keeping it are important. And so I'm not sure necessarily like, because like I'm in the process, my family has the bucket, the infamous bucket. My great aunt has a bucket of all the photos and all the things. She currently doesn't want to give it up. I come over occasionally with like a little bottle of 𝘰𝘦𝘳𝘢𝘕 and try to entice her to like drink with me and give it up. I have not left with that bucket yet.
𝘱𝘰𝘴𝑴𝑦, open up the gate, 𝘱𝑰𝑂, open up the gate.
You might want to get one photo at a time.
Right? But what like through my experience seeing archives, seeing what can happen with them when you don't get a hold of them, and like actually somebody who's interested in preserving them and keeping them, sometimes it's like, I want to sit with her and like go through each photo and label each photo because I don't know those people. Yeah. So it's like, I want that time. So we've been trying to like ease into it, but I think about the layers of archiving and like people making it accessible, people doing the actual preservation work, people then doing the representing, people revisualizing what it can be. So I think like all the pieces are extremely critical. But I think we need to like make archiving cute. We need to make it fun. We need to make it like, because like that's the piece that's gonna make people value even printing off their photos from their phones. You know what I mean? It's like, well, why do I need that? iCloud got me. It's like, okay, well, just like get a physical piece, just a little something.
I think that's definitely going to be a challenge for some of us making it fun. But what I actually thought the opposite in terms of a lot of us diving into archives, it's really painful. And so even though, but at the same time, I see the fun aspect that you speak of, because, I don't know, 𝘱𝑰𝑄 Brown, I was there this past weekend and walking through the halls and seeing those images of all of those, you know, the women in their dresses and their, you know, garb, and just the way in which you knew the community was really vibrant at a time that you didn't exist. And it brings some life back. And that you can imagine, like, wow, it looked like they were just partying every weekend, or, you know, it was just always a ball or something really vibrant going on. But the flip side of it is some people don't want to talk about, you know, because it's been held so close and it's so painful. My mom won't give up her photos. She won't let me. It's like some of the people that she's no longer able to talk about, she won't tell me, you know. And so, and she's not alone from working with all the elders we work with in our program. And it's tears and, you know, just a lot of pain that comes out when you're sitting down looking through those boxes and looking at those photos. But you had something, and I don't want to, no.
I done moved on. I started thinking about working. I had no clue how much I was teaching, and I was teaching literature and writing at Hamlin. I had no, and I thought I'm just going to come and do what I was doing when I was in grad school. I'm going to be looking at archives. I'm going to be real smart. I had no clue how much emotional labor would be required, especially dealing with donors, people who have worked their whole lives to gather up, especially folks in Black studies. Their whole lives, they were, as my teacher, John Wright, told me, the first class in African American literature I took was the one I taught, because they didn't exist on campus. And they were like, well, you got to go make it, right? So a whole life's work, and then you retire, and they start giving you your department, former department starts putting pressure on you to empty out your office, and you got to get rid of it. And then you got to deal with some grubby curator.
Hey, I'm also a historian, so I can hide behind that.
But it can be a very emotional process, a very emotional process.
Well, I think even just to add, like my experience working with Hollywood Studio of Dance, it was like you don't know that you're kind of bumping up against a wall, because I think how we express emotions sometimes, it's very varied. But it's like, even when little things happen where it's like the day that, like for example, me and Miss Diane, we had a time where I would try to, I was supposed to come over and grab things to take away to like go copy. And like, she would stop returning my phone calls. She'd be like, And she lives out, she's like down the street from me. So I would like show up and I'd be like, oh, hey, how are you doing? She's like, you came to take my stuff. And I'm like, I'm gonna bring it back. I'm bringing it back. And then I think we like developed a level of trust where I would take away and bring back in better condition or like in the same condition. And then like eventually I would start getting like emails and text messages at like 8 p.m. like, oh, I found this old photo. I found this old book. Do you want to scan this too? Do you want this too? And so it became, it really eased up, but I think it really changed, our dynamic changed when she felt that I equally cared about her stuff as much as she did. And so she was like, I trust you enough to know that you're going to not only care for it, but like care for it in a way that's not just like these random photos, these like random things. Like these are 32 years of her life committed to one thing. Like that's her life's work. And so it's like even her understanding why I was interested in it. Like she was like, what do you want to do with it? What are you doing?
No, that's a great point. Like, how do you convince somebody of their value?
Yes.
Like people will say, I mean, people who've been doing this much longer than me tend to say the thing that people say most frequently is, I don't have any papers.
Yeah.
Say, yes, you do. Yeah. You just don't think about your life that way, right? It's worthy of kind of documenting in this way. And so one of the things you have to do is convince people of their value. Like, no, you do have something that people, my grandmother had this photo by Charles Chambliss. I had no clue, hanging up on the wall that tells the story that researchers help to tell. How this little moment, 1 February 1976, is a part of a story you already know. It was roots, the next generation, when they got up north in the 60s, and when they started celebrating blackness and black history, it was that. It's connected to these grand narratives that we learn about in school. Underground Railroad, Great Migration, right? Things like that. It says, no, mama, grandmama, big mama, your story, right, about the Elks Club, right, or the folks over here on the south side, the Masons, right, is directly connected to black liberation and Jim Crow and all these things, right, these bigger narratives. Yeah. We do that work, the researchers and the folks who are interpreting.
So all this through Seeking the Lost, which is just an example. It's one exhibit. It's one story that encompasses a lot more that's actually visible to the eye almost. It tells a story, one angle of a community coming from a whole southern hemisphere of this country, moving and really trying to retrace and reconnect and, like you said, find the wealth and the worth, those things that are most important to you. That's what I'm hearing your archival process has been. And I feel like this evening we could talk. I have like so many other statements in there, but I know we're almost at a wrap. But one word, kind of like how the audience started with one word to describe an archive, one word that you would use to describe your archival process. I know you put that mic down.
Because it's not about me.
Your archival process.
Abundance.
Abundance. Love it.
Curiosity.
Slow.
Slow. I'd say steady.
Slow down.
Steady. Yeah. Well, thank you guys. I'd like to thank you.
Wow. Okay. Okay, one more time. Give it up again. One more time. Yeah. So beautiful. Dang. Okay, so get them phones out again. And we're gonna have a Q&A. You can use Slido and you can use this QR code. Again, keep it classy, keep it cute, keep it respectful, keep it, pointed at the people. And also, if you have specific folks you want to ask questions to, this is Zania, this is Davu, this is Jojo, and this is Raquette. So you can write their name in your question if you want to ask one of them specifically the question. And Miss Raquette will ask your question out loud. And also, if you do not want to use Slido or don't have a smartphone, we do have pieces of paper in the back. You can write those down, put it in a little collection plate, as the panel referred to it when they gave me this idea to use a collection plate. So you can write your question down in the back, put it in that basket, and I'll bring it up to the front for Raquette to read your question out loud as well. If you see a question, they should show up on your phone as well. And if you see a question that you like, that you actually want to hear answered as well, you can like it, and that will move it up higher on the list.
Okay. So what does the archive tell you, us living into 2025 and beyond? So as we move into 2025, what does the archive tell us?
Fight like they did.
Fight like they did. That sounds like that should sum it up. Okay. How might we think of sculptures, statues of Confederates or former enslavers as archival objects? Should they be removed? Should they stay? That's a good question. What do you think? I would say look to Germany. They have had one of the examples of that in the modern day. Most people know when they think about Nazism. And if you go to Germany, I don't think you'll see any Nazi representation of that era. And so I think as much as we might talk about the Germans and that era, we should look to the example that they've actually,
Yeah, and then maybe they could, instead of being destroyed, go into the hands of people like us who could interpret that history for people.
Exactly.
And again, kind of see it from a different historical lens instead of venerating.
Up till now, I've been like, no, keep it. You don't want it. Nope, keep it. You got to make sure people know. You got to make sure the babies know how crazy white folks was. You got to keep it out there. But it occurs to me, we're talking about public spaces. At Givens Collection, we have not only the bright, shiny moments of representing Black greatness and all that we've overcome, but we also have a first edition of Thomas Dixon Jr.'s The Klansman, the novel that the film A Birth of a Nation was based on, inscribed lovingly to his good racist friend. As evidence. Yeah. We got Mammy and Moe's salt and pepper shakers, right? We got those ex-slave narratives I told you about that were kept for nefarious reasons. You keep it. You keep the evidence. It's different, though, when it's in a public space.
Totally agree. How to start and preserve our own family's archive.
I would say kind of similar to genealogy, like when you're getting like testing done or whatever, finding like the oldest person in your family and talking to them, especially if they have their own photos, or even if like the photos aren't there, still finding the oldest person and like bringing that stuff to them because they're the closest to it. So yeah.
I think something as simple as labeling person, place, and thing that's in the photos. I mean, most people don't know. Most of the children won't know who that person was, or, you know, where they were and when that was taken. So just those simple things to start with, and get it out of, you know, those moist basements or those hot attics, and, you know, invest in a box or, you know, something that's actually light sensitive or will allow you to kind of preserve it a little longer. Okay, I'm slow at this. How does one, oh. Let's move on. Do you consider adding current history into the archives?
I do it. I don't just consider it, I do it. Yeah, happens, yeah. No, that's a good question, though.
It is
People
a good-
assume that it's just historical. No,
Old
we
stuff.
also have artists come over and interpret, and plug, December 7th. You can buy tickets now at the Cedar Cultural Center. The Givens Collection is hosting an event called Flowers Now, celebration of Black elders in the arts community. And we're using this as an opportunity. There will be performances, an award ceremony. Gina Andrade, Setu Jones, Carolyn Holbrook, Tacumba Aiken, Janice Lane Ewart, Douglas Ewart, Faye Washington, Donna Washington, Babatunde Leah, people who are above 70, who have been, I spent all my, much of my day-to-day trying to find, designing an event program and working within the limitations of space to say what I need to say about these amazing elders. Quite a challenge, humbling, rewarding, so that people know about them now. So you said contemporary, now, before they're gone. And we're using this as an opportunity, this is to the point about how to collect your stuff, to announce a launch of a performing arts archive within the Givens Collection that I'm starting. And then we're going to be holding events where we invite people over to the library and talk about what you might have at home that you don't even realize might be of some value. But how to keep it yourself, because you don't necessarily want to give your stuff away to an institution like this. But how to keep it, how to organize it, and what you might think, what you might do with it after you're gone.
I think my experience might be kind of like opposite to that in a way that, again, I'm studying to be a historian. I'm a PhD candidate here, and I study change over time, right? So to me, whatever is new or whatever is generated from this will become history. So that's just kind of, and wondering how historians will interpret that, since that's their job to do, is to interpret these documents, moments, events. So I think that's a harder question for me, because it's like of how the lens I'm coming from, you know, and I wonder if we all have different lenses because of different backgrounds.
I would say, I think, like, my first response to this question is, so Ricky and I have an art collective that we've had for 7 years, and we started it fresh out of college. And we now, because of my interest in moving image and her interest in photography, we have like photos of our friends and like artist peers from when they first started, people's first performances, people's first time saying they were whatever the thing that they wanted to be. So I think now we have this like wealth of like footage and visual representation of like progress over time, and also like community over time. And so I think about it just as like, if you don't start now, then you won't have it later. So yeah, I think it is now. It's evolving.
Right,
So.
and then different people, hopefully more people like us will be, exactly. So that's where I guess that's where we could presently be, is how we're in it, but yeah.
Okay. Do we need to prioritize physical archives, given the erasure of the internet archives? Given the erasure.
I love a physical copy. In the digital era, I just love a physical copy. Whenever my friends publish books or anything, or like their dissertations are printed, I wanna hold it. I, as somebody who's always worked in digital mediums, and like a lot of my career has ran on like post-production and editing, I'm on like my computer a lot, so I just really value a physical copy of something, of anything.
definitely agree. Gotta touch it. Let's see. In this particular era, where we see history being replayed and the erasure of identities, communities being slyly written into laws and policies, how have you all thought about the magnitude of preservation today? And then it says, example, what doing so is in real time will mean for the future.
I have not been in a street fight in a really long time.
I'm
So-
sorry, I don't ever imagine.
So I'm scared. I think that it's going to mean standing up for ourselves a lot. That's what I think it's going to mean. Cutting through a lot of bullshit. Keeping your people close to you. Don't go in alone. Keeping your people close to you. That's what I think it is. Queer folks, black folks. I'm just thinking about Jewish folks, the folks that are represented over in my library, my colleagues that especially are facing community in a really in ways that some of the collections aren't, where community feels a great stake in what our collections represent. We're going to have to stay connected and stand up for what we're here to preserve.
This is a long one. Large institutions like a university library or a historical society can create strength through bringing disparate collections together and preserving, conserving objects, but they can also create barriers to access. What can community archives do that large institutions cannot, and how can the large institutions support community archives? I feel like I wrote that question. Thank you, whoever wrote it. But can I? Our organization actually in Black Ink started because of that whole concept of people feeling not seen, heard, or not included. And so we currently have just a small number of archives that we've been trying to build, and it's primarily from local folks around the community. We've also been teaching individual families how to collect their own archives, how to preserve their own materials, and how to just make it accessible to the rest of their family as well. I think part of the issue has been that the archive, there's just so much space, that you can actually utilize to say, and you can't save everything. And so typically a lot of the larger institutions kind of have an idea of what they want to preserve, and it has to have like a really weighty history connected to it in terms of the person or the people or the item. And I know maybe not the Gibbons, but it doesn't kind of speak to the little, the little guy or the folks that might not see themselves as being notable, to the community. And so I think that's an absolute necessity. And so part of why we started is to really help people learn their worth, their wealth, and preserve that, and not throw their, when your ancestors or your elders transition, don't throw it away. There's history there, there's cultural legacies there, and you need to pass those on. So I really love that question. Thank you for whoever asked. It looks like we have just, one more question. Oh, wow, okay. There's a lot of questions. That means you have to engage in discussions once we're done, and you can come up and talk to any one of us. But I'm actually gonna do one that I know has been on here. Were you inspired by a specific story or person to begin to do archival work?
I would say for sure. My mom was like our family genealogy person, and my great grandmother, very much so for me is like that like folkloric vibe. Her name is Granny Fat. Her real name was Willie Lee, and just like hearing everybody's account of her and like how that worked really got me pulled into like the ideas of oral history and how you can rely on like all these different components to make up a person. I've never met my great grandmother. She passed away when my oldest brother was like a baby. And so, but I feel like I know her and I reference her in ways that people are like, oh, did you know your great grandmother? I'm like, not really. But so it's like even like little things like to this day, her thing was collard greens. She loved collard greens. She wasn't a lovey-dovey person, but like anybody was welcome in her home. Her house was the house everybody came to when they migrated from the South. She smoked cigarettes. She loved gin, and she loved to be barefoot in her garden of collard greens, drinking gin and smoking cigarettes. So.
Nice combination.
I think I have an answer for that. This is maybe strange, but Anne Rice actually. So I don't know. I'm probably dating myself too, my age. But so Anne Rice wrote like the Vampire Chronicles. Okay, so it became the movie Interview with the Vampire, one of them. But Anne Rice is from Louisiana. She also writes fiction about historical events and people like free people of color. And I was like in middle school, right? Not getting that information from school and being like, oh, there were people who were actually free during slavery. I thought everybody was enslaved, right? And it's like, oh, okay, so there's like a racial hierarchy happening, or they were artisans. Like, how did they become free, right? Where did they go? So I just think it's just a testament to this intersections I think we were talking about anyway. Art, but also literature, fiction, doesn't have to just be a nonfiction book. I think you can be inspired by other things.
Yes. There are people who have inspired me to do this work. Most recently, our dear Aunt Joyce, who passed away 2 years ago. She was the matriarch in the family. She was the keeper. She was the storyteller. During COVID, she and I spoke a lot on the phone, 4-hour-long storytelling sessions with Aunt Joyce, me pacing the floor, just listening, soaking it up. And she would tell me stories about, she would just recall things over and over again. And she said to me at one point, you got to remember these names. She said, McMore, Wallace, Curry. And she said, I was in Hastings once, and we drove past the cemetery, and I felt like I had been there before. And then some people came knocking about the research they were doing in Hastings, and I went back to Aunt Joyce, and I said, you'll never know what I just found out. McMore, Wallace, Curry were all families connected to Hastings. They were our cousins. It bees that way sometimes.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I just wanted to end with one statement. I had a school residency this morning, and one of the little fifth graders raised his hand and asked, so thank you for sharing this Black history with us. Are you going to be able to share that like with the other classes? And the presenter at the time said, well, this isn't just Black history. This is Minnesota history. This is national history. This is international history. And then I saw a quote that's been kind of floating around the internet that said, slavery is white history, and those who experienced and survived it, that's Black history. And so we have to stop cutting the lives of our archives and our experiences in half and erasing the parts that we don't want to talk about because we think it's too painful, because then it gives us a sense of, I don't know, just a siloed existence. And we're human beings, all of us. I have elders that say, red blood flows through everybody's veins, or actually blue, but, but when it comes out, it's red. And so thank you guys. You've been a wonderful audience. I hope that you continue the conversation, and I hope that you'll share the questions with us so that if there's questions, answers that we can provide, we can send that back, because there was quite a few more questions on there. Thank you.
Yes. Wow. So like Raquette said, please feel free to come up and ask any questions, or something that Z and I often talk about at our events and encourage people to do. It's like in Minnesota, we're encouraged to like be quiet and like weird, like and hold so much in, right? Like, oh, I was moved, I'm just gonna go sit with that in the corner and be weird, you know. But no, you can say that to the person that moved you, right? Or you can go up to somebody and say, I really enjoyed your energy during the talk, or I noticed that you said, at this point of the talk, and it hit me. And I want to share this story with you. Like, you never know what the words that you share with somebody is going to do for them. So I highly encourage you after this conversation to connect to somebody tonight, whether it be a panelist or somebody in the audience, and give them some love, or let them know that something that they said, or ask more questions. And then lastly, we are still open. So please go see Seeking for the Lost. JoJo, you did your big one on that exhibition, okay? So please go see Seeking for the Lost, and we will be sending you a survey. I know, you're like, survey, I'm not gonna do it, but please do it. Because we just wanna know what we can improve on and what you enjoyed, so we know what to keep and what to leave behind, okay? We really value your opinion. Yes, and JoJo has something to say.
There is an audience member, too, you might be interested in. Jeremiah Ellis is here, putting a spotlight on you. He is actually one of AICM's board members. He's a historian. He's written a couple articles about Black Minnesota history. But maybe more importantly, I don't know, his family also has deep roots in Minnesota, too. So he's also a vessel of this knowledge. Yep, hi, you're here.
Thank you, JoJo. So yeah, have a great night. Thank you for coming.